The purpose of this talk is about failures and learning from your failures. So, yeah, and over the years I've had them, and they're quite interesting. So you've got excessive dysentery, you've got deformed wing with pretty much aborted larvae, mites on bees, funny looking cells, poop everywhere. Not sure what's wrong with that one, it looks okay. I think there's a couple of mites on bees there. And then you've got high mortality, low mortality. So there's all these things, the more you keep bees and the more you compare things, the more you'll see there's a story behind a lot of things. Who here has made a beekeeping mistake? Okay, go ahead. Who's thrown a frame full of bees, maybe even with the queen, across the bee hive? Nobody? Am I the only one? Who's thrown a frame of bees by accident? Like turning to do something and it hits the edge of a hive and the frame goes flying and the bees everywhere? Okay, good.
So are you saying that's something we should avoid?
As much as you can. Did you know it was a mistake before you made it? Okay, so sometimes, yes, you know. And you're like, I should have known better. Sometimes it's an accident, or sometimes you didn't have all the info. So the point is, over the years, I've learned, shit, why can't I do that again? Okay, regardless if I take notes, a lot of times it has to do with cutting corners, because time. And I did like his comments around how we use time as an excuse, but it's us. So if yes, why did you do it? Just because. And then if no, did you learn a lesson? So what I'm going to go is I'm going to go through some lessons. And what are the most common mistakes? So what are the most common mistakes that people make out there? How about for a new beekeeper that's just starting? What's a common mistake? Overfeeding or underfeeding?
Or not feeding correctly.
Yeah.
Too much space.
Too much space? Underestimating these guys. So this is one of those bears that lives around my house. Beautiful bear. And I remember, and this is a 4-year cub, or it's a 4-year bear, and he had a sister and 2 brothers. And actually, no, there was 3 cubs total. And the mallard, and they spent the whole summer hanging around, walking around, and you bump into them and say, oh, I'm going to go walk this way. And so, but it was great. And then this is the mites, as we know. So, who's used AI? Okay? So this talk was actually 3 years ago, and I haven't changed it, but I asked ChatGPT, I said, what are the top most or 5 most common beekeeping mistakes? So here, insufficient research preparation, neglecting regular inspections, inadequate varroa control, poor queen management. So again, this where I was talking about assessing your queen. How good is your queen? We can actually do stuff like that. It takes time. It takes a couple intervals, but you can judge how good your queen is. And overfeeding, underfeeding. So then here, why do beekeepers keep making these mistakes? Lack of experience, overconfidence, information overload, and this is a big one. There's a lot of stuff out there. And one reason I started doing my own research and my own studies, my own observation is it just didn't make sense that I would take advice from a person in Georgia or in Nova Scotia in a completely different context, especially if it was connected to the environment. But then I started listening to what they were trying to say and the principle, and then it's applying the principles to your context. So inconsistent advice, and this is, for example, if you ask me, you ask Matt, you ask this person, we're all going to say something different. Or we'll say it depends. Okay? We talked about this one, underestimating time and resources commitment. So the reason I go from 4 to 12, when I have 12, It's actually harder work because I keep 3 yards. And this one time there was a community garden out in Parkcross, which is about a 40-minute drive. I thought it'd be a great idea to hit the community out. But then it was like 2 hours to go back and forth, plus the time there, and it was like, wow, I'd waste the whole Friday take care of bees over there. So natural challenges are weather, wind, dry, hot, and I'd say in the Yukon, this was the biggest one, is lack of mentorship and community support. There was 2 longtime beekeepers, but they were hoarders of information. They wanted you to make all the mistakes they did, and there was no sharing. So very little sharing, so hence the reason I started that Facebook group and started a bee club and started doing workshops. Why? Because we needed to start sharing that. So what Tim is doing here and what Keith and the different folks are doing, trying to get people together, I think there's too much politics in bees. If I don't say the same thing you say, that's okay. We need to learn to dialogue, not debate things and saying you're right or wrong, and get more to what the crux of the problem is. And that's going to be most of the talk. So our brain. Typically we seek the easy answer. We love cutting corners. We're often in a hurry. It's usually biased to our past experiences. It loves jumping to conclusions. We're talking about our brains. It doesn't know what it doesn't know. Okay? So a lot of the reasons I do my talks to the intermediate level, and even advanced, is I want you to know what you don't know. Because once you don't know what you don't know, then you can actually start learning. And for example, when I go talks or I go to conferences, I say, I don't want to do beginner talks. I'm going to do intermediate to high level. Why? Because we need to stretch folks, and it's the only way you learn. The reason I use charts is there's always some naysayers out there, and it's just to help with that conversation. It thinks it knows more than it does. So we call that the Dunning-Kruger effect, and there's a curve. So I work in mining. I'm a manager of maintenance usually, so I have hundreds of people reporting to me. And when I have a young apprentice starting out, they're so overconfident. They think they know it all. They just came out of trade school, and it's like, holy mackerel. And you gotta calm them down, slow them down, and do that hazard awareness. All the stuff we do in our work life, you can apply to what we do in this. It hates being wrong. It will seek to argue and justify being right. It likes to be pedantic and sometimes has an ego. We nitpick on the little details that are irrelevant. It tends to ask people it knows agree with it. So groupthink. Okay? So if I know he's going to put me in my place or challenge me, I'll probably go talk to the person who I know agrees with me. Okay? Hence the reason debate, dialogue is so critical. It is comforted by routine, old ways, and naturally stubborn. Status quo. I'm a pot stirrer. I love stirring pot. Why? Because it forces thinking. It challenges folks out of their comfort zones. And it has trouble putting itself in other people's shoes, and sometimes in the bees, in this case. Okay? That's the reason we debate a lot. And we get back to this justify being right. So once you know this stuff and you start becoming self-aware, I'm doing an emotional intelligence course right now, but it applies to beekeeping. Once you're self-aware of what your triggers are and how your brain works, you can actually be a better thinker. Because our brain, something happens, you have a reaction, you form a judgment, you start making up stories to justify your judgment, you look in the past for things that reinforces your judgment, and then you predict the future. So that's called an automatic listening cycle, automatic thinking cycle. So as a beekeeper, we a lot of times fall into this trap. We get a failure, and we try to pawn it off on something without doing the homework. A lot of times I hear beekeepers say, oh, my bees died because of wet, condensation, because the bees are all wet. And then I say, did you inspect that colony the hour after they died? They say, no, it's been about a month. I say, do you know how condensation works? How dew point works, and how every day you'll get a condensation event in that closed box with the dead bees. Bees are sponges. Over time, they'll collect a lot of moisture. So if you didn't check that box within days of it dying, you can't save moisture or condensation. Okay? But you hear that a lot. So literally, this is critical thinking. Before you have a reaction, you need to start thinking. Okay, so sometimes you're like, wow. So I see this, I see some baby bees, nice and furry, beautiful. I think somebody slide something bad with this one. It's not too bad. Okay, the holes here, the cells are a little bit dry to my flavor, but I think this was early spring, first inspection, and I'm seeing baby bees. Okay, 28 days before that, I put my pollen back. So there's capped brood, there's baby bees. I love baby bees. Why? It makes me so happy. Because they're the future. Okay, so early season, you want to see a lot of healthy baby bees. And when I point these out to new beekeepers, they're like, oh. Because once they start recognizing baby bees, then you'll see them all over the place. Over here, again, those debris boards tell you so much stuff. So this is chalk brood. For one time, it was full of, it looked like lint. And it was about an inch of lint-like stuff in the bottom board. I was like, what the hell is that? So I stuck it in my microscope, I looked at it, and there's all these fibers. I was like, what the hell is that? And then somebody said, oh, those are the cocoons. So the bees that cleaned out a lot of the old frames and cleaned out the cocoons because probably they're getting too small. Or maybe I had too many old frames in there. I was like, interesting. But yeah, the bees speak a language. We just need to learn to translate what they're trying to tell us. So we have emotional triggers. Okay, so my colony's not growing. My bees aren't doing anything. My bees swarmed. My hive absconded. I see a pile of dead bees in front of my hive. I never get any honey. I got stung in the face. Because I remember the first time I brought my wife 20 years ago to my bee colony, we finally had a bit of honey in there. Took the hive tool. I said, honey. I took my veil off. I think she had a veil. She took it off. I gave her the honey and sat right here on the lip. And then I got one in the eye here, just below the eye. And so we went back home. We were both swollen up. But it was like, and she said, I'll never go back to the bee yard ever again. But it can be fun. So much fur comb, bridge comb. I can't see any eggs. I can't find my queen. So usually, if you look for the queen, you won't see her. So stop looking for her. It's full of drones, a bunch of eggs in each cell. So there's all these cues. This is bee language. And each one of these, there's a story behind it. And our job as a beekeeper is to figure it out. I see poop all over the front of my colony, and then ... Okay, so the reason I do this is, these are all mine. I've done all this, but over time you start learning the cues. Again, the environment, the weather, the nutrition pattern, the type of bees, and there's just so many. So just the last thing on the brain. So you see a frame like this, you say, oh wow, there's honey, a bit of spottiness here, and your fast brain is the emotional brain. It reacts, and usually it controls your emotions, it controls your first reaction. Okay, so if I said, what's the capital of the US? What's 2.2 or 2 plus 2? Pretty fast. Okay, so condition of the frame, honey, brood, spotty. So this is where you can actually train your brain to be unbiased, but you need to use the other brain. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so the risk here, if you just go quick, is it's complacency. Okay, you won't take the time to really look, because this same frame here is this. Okay, so you can see where there's this and that's not brood, so it was probably EFB. I did test for AFB and it wasn't that. But there was drought, it was hot, we had hit 30 degrees Celsius, so which is like 90, and we had about a week of 90 dry, no rain for about a month. RH would drop to just below 10% almost every day, and dry. Okay? So this was like, wow. Okay, so the slow brain is the thinking brain. That's your critical thinking. So if I asked you, what's the capital of Canada? So it's Ottawa. So maybe that was the slow brain. But if I say what's the capital of the US, it's fast. You know that already. Okay? I was tricking you. So number of cells on one side of a frame. Okay, so how many cells? So was it 7,000?
Deep or medium?
Let's go deep. It's 3.5.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. EFB, snot root, PMS, might count. So you can see how as you're doing these things, you need to collect data, information, before you form judgment. The risk sometimes is we take too long. We don't want all the information. So this is the problem with engineers. We want all the info before making a call. Okay? So it's finding a mentor, information, and you're bouncing back and forth. So sometimes you need to make a call, do it right away, because you won't be back in that yard for a week. And waiting a week, a lot of times, is too late. Because literally, like you, I can make a half mistake a season. If I make one major mistake, my season is done. That whole colony won't produce any honey. It'll make it through winter, but it won't make any honey. If I make a mistake with that queen, if I make a key mistake around a certain treatment, a certain approach, adding the box, the bees swarming off, it's really easy. I mean, when I tell folks down south about, I make one mistake, my season's done, they're like, but I'm like, well, my season's 2.5 months, so there's just no time. So it's about knowing the difference. So I'm not going to bore you too much with a lot of this stuff, but critical thinking is that logic brain, but you need information. Okay? So when you go to your bee yard, if you do take notes, is it sunny, cloudy, is it windy, when was the last rain, with the weather stations. Now I've got a weather station in my bee yard, so I have it all there, so I can just look it up. But weather is critical. What was in bloom the last time you walked your dog? Okay, so what's it smell like? Because if you live in the forest, you can smell the forest. You can smell what's blooming. And the more you, those are the little cues that you can start cueing in on. So be curious, ask a lot of questions. You don't need the answer. You just need a question. Because there's probably people in this room that might be able to help you with the answer. Okay, so critical thinking is more about the question than the answer. So the reason I collected all this data and the millions of data points is I had a lot of questions. And then it forced me, so how do we get the answer? And then it forced me to jump in. So be logical, make observations, look for evidence, pros and cons, hypothesize. It's okay to hypothesize. Say, oh, this could have happened, this. What are the things that are required for this to be the hypothesis? Try to prove yourself wrong. It's okay. That's what learning is about. Be open-minded. This is about go talk to that beekeeper who's your complete opposite. The beekeeper, you close your eyes there and you're like, oh. and then go ask them a question. Because they're going to give you an answer you won't want to hear. And that's part of learning. You don't need to agree with it. But you can ask questions to try to figure out where they're coming from. And that's how we grow as beekeepers. Okay, so I have trouble with this one because I'm always right. But it's a skill you can learn. Bite your lip. So problem solving, so what if then, so if this happened, do this. So that big chart that I had with the managing bees and all these activities and when to do it, or generally when to do it, is actually based on if then. If this happens, if this flower starts blooming, then this is the next step. And then in my brain, I have my whole season mapped out. Even though I didn't have time last summer to beekeep, I got more honey than ever, and I put them to bed in a decent condition. Why? Because I have a system. And then reflect on bee things. And this is where you retrospect, say, I messed up, I made a mistake. What could I have done? What were the contributing factors? I'm telling you right now, there is never a single reason for any of our failures. There's multiple reasons. Some of them contribute more, because I find right now, rural months down south, it's an excuse for everybody. But I say that's a symptom. It's a beekeeper. So if I ask you, who's lost a colony here? And if I ask you the question, whose fault is it? If you do this, you're in the right place. But if you point at your neighbor, then you got room to learn. Okay, so the sooner you realize it's your fault, regardless, even if you had a hailstorm. So I go down south, and first year I went to the Bee Expo, or when it was Hive Life, I think Texas got a bunch of snow, and it was really cold, and I'm like, wait. And then I said, whose fault is it? And then they were trying to blame the weather. I said, no, it's you for not being prepared for extremes. I said, it's got nothing to do with the weather, it's you. He mentioned starvation. If you look at most of the causes of our winter failures, starvation is one, inadequate size of the colony going into winter, all these things. And I'm like, those are all symptoms. Those are not causes. Those are symptoms. The root cause is our decisions. So the reasons I'm doing this talk is learn the consequences of your decisions so you can improve and build your if-then scenarios. So, like I said, I teach a lot of leadership stuff now on top of engineering, but basically de bono is a process I use to teach people how to think, and it's super easy. Okay, you can use hats. The first one is, yep, the white hat is facts. What are the facts? So you have a decision to make, okay? Do I super or do I not super? Do I pull my honey or do I not pull my honey? Okay, so what are the facts? So what are the options? What could I do? What are the pros and cons? How might I feel about this? Gut feel is a valid feeling, because usually gut feel is based on past experience. With all this info, it's actually quite good. Ask for other people's perspective. And then here, process is, there's their guide, YouTube, mentor, tools, training. And what works great is I teach engineers to listen to other folks, and I get them to use this method to get people together. So say this table of 8. I'd say I put a problem statement in the middle, and then you 8 would go through this one hat at a time to try to solve this problem. You can do it on your own. I'd say at some of your beekeeping meetings, if you had a problem, something that's plaguing your area, do a de bono exercise. Break the group up into little groups, put your question, and get folks to go through, and because this is perspectives. You'll get different perspectives, perceptions of the problem, and then you'll have 3 tables presenting what they talked about, and you'll see it'll be either completely different or very aligned, but it'll make people think outside the box. So it actually works quite well. Become a master chef. A good beekeeper understands the key principles, creates wonders, splits honey, queens, good wintering, lots of LBBs, are adaptable, and know how to think. An amateur beekeeper follows this recipe, but can't adapt. Doesn't know why they do things. And they repeat the same mistakes, They do what they're told, and it's very emotional. Okay? I remember the first, I think it's the next slide, where I lost my first, one winter I lost all my colonies. It was horrible, but I use it as a learning exercise. Okay, so know your bee math. Because if you know your bee math, the basic biology, you can see it live in your colony. So important. Okay? If you're going to raise your own queens, know the timing. So this was my calendar when I was trying to mate queens in the Yukon. 2016 was beautiful because it was like no frost all summer. It was a nice long summer. Wind was good. And the queens that I created on that summer were wonderful. The next summer was horrible. So, but there's things you can learn. I think, yeah. So actually this swarm cell here was beautiful. It created a beautiful queen. So I took that, put it in another box, brought it to my other yard, because I don't have like massive, I'm the only beekeeper in my area. So the only drones I have are my drones. So, and it's like 2 to 4 colonies per yard. So what I did is I grabbed that swarm cell, put her in a note box, added some open brood, lots of worker bees. I used the Doolittle method to pull the worker bees or the nurse bees up. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, so I'll save it for after because you need to know how to do this.
Yep.
Okay, so what it is take a frame of open brood. You put an extra box on top of your colony, put a queen excluder. Shake all the bees off first. Shake, put your excluder, put the frame above, and then close it up. Come back 2 hours later, that frame is full of nurse bees. You know the queen's not there because you put your excluder. The foragers go out. Those are the bees you want when you have a thing like this. When you're trying to take care of your queens, when you're trying to do things, you want lots of nurse bees. Nurse bees don't care where they're going. Foragers are the ones that get pissed off if you move them. But nurse bees that haven't been outside, they haven't done an orientation flight. So if you're building colonies, you want to raise your own queens, you need a lot of other nurse bees. Sometimes, if you want a good book, it's called, it's by Dr. Connor. I think when he came, I bought it. It was like Beekeeping Essentials, and there's 2 that they're wonderful books. If you want to take your beekeeping to beginner to intermediate, those are the books you need because he covers those techniques that are practical, useful, or universal. But in a nutshell, this slide here is about know your biology. And biology is fun because learning is a cycle. There's the do, there's the read, reflect on, there's the think, there's the feel. So as a beekeeper, you want to go through the whole 4 modes of learning. Because that's how you're going to learn. Just reading, not good enough. You need to do. In the winter, we read a lot. Okay, but at some point, you need to start doing it. So this, getting nurse bees, just do it. It's good. So I showed you this before, but you need a version of this in your head or on paper for your area. And because the question is, do you know why I do all these things? And they're pretty obvious to me. But a new beekeeper may not know all the little differences, may not know why they do certain things. And you can see how I did put some comments, small cluster bees, less than 6 frames or less, make it into a single or a smaller box. Basically, large hives can take advantage of the June flow. So if I've got a starting colony or colony that doesn't have a lot of excess honey, I'm going to feed that colony. Why? Because I want that brood box full of sugar, honey, as much as possible before the honey flow, or else the bees will just use the nature honey and put it in that box. But luckily, I never have to do that. Because the June flow is so beautiful, and now that my bees are always swarming towards May, they're full of bees. and they're harvesting willow stuff and the native flowers, and they're filling that bottom box by, I'd say, early June. That bottom box is already 100 pounds. So it's perfect for my singles management because now they've got the food they need for any dearth. So there's a couple of these questions. So you can't keep bees where you live. So I was getting that a lot because I live on a place that's called Annie Lake Road. So it's between Whitehorse and Skagway, and there's a microclimate. So you've got peaks that are, I don't know, 7,000 feet, so 2,000 meters to 3,000 meters, and we get an inversion every single day. And so I'll look at the weather in Whitehorse, and if it says 5 degrees or 10 degrees there, Celsius, I know I'm at risk of frost. So my wife and I would go out in the garden, we put all these row covers on everything because we know we're probably gonna get frost. Okay, so know your climate. So the first year I kept bees, I followed Southern advice, where they said, oh, you want partial shade later in the afternoon because it's gonna be hot and the bees need a bit of shade. No. Okay? But again, beekeeping for dummies and no mentors in the Yukon and the internet is where I was getting my info. So what I did do is I compared a wood colony to a poly, and then my first winter setup, I knew I needed wind protection. Because if I look this way, it's open, I see pretty much all the way to Carcross, there's a big massive mountain there, it's a big valley, and the wind just blows up that valley, right to where these bees were. I did do an insulated shell, but guess what? This colony did super well, came out of winter, but the wood one died pretty early in the season. Wasn't a surprise. But what I did now is I made a new yard right over here in full sun. And I moved my bees over here, but I didn't know about the 3 mile rule. So all the bees came back right here. So I've learned now to inch it, but it was cool. All I did to do is put a box there, and overnight they went in the box, and then the next morning I brought them over. And eventually I left it sealed up so for a day, and then the next day they did a new orientation flight, and everything was hunky-dory after that. So literally, this is my bee cycle, and this was one temperature sensor. And it doesn't matter the numbers, but what it is the red line, the flat one, when it's flat, it means the queen is laying. Then it drops, and then it goes back up. And then this here is the temperature, the daily temperature fluctuations, and we get diurnals of like 20 degrees Celsius almost every day. So 10 to 20, sometimes 30. So it's quite drastic on the bees. So what's the relation between this and the food cycle? What's the relationship between population dynamics? So the number of bees out there, when, versus my feeding habits and local pollens. And then over here was, luckily I'm an engineer and I learned this stuff in school. And I do a lot of carpentry working on my house. So I understood the basics of heat loss and convections and radiation and all that. So it wasn't a leap of, oh wow, because it's actually quite easy to model this. But anyways, this is where I quickly figured out that the volume, it's volume to bees. That was the key factor, is too little bees in a big volume is a recipe for disaster, condensation, right? Because you get all the dew points and all the stuff happening inside, and the bees stay chill in there. They can't get out. Because a lot of times that bottom box, if you do doubles, for me, becomes a nice box, especially if you use some polys. It's cooler. Okay? So imagine the ground is frozen 15 feet. Then you've got a bunch of honey frames and the bees have moved up to the top box. And then you get minus 30 still, minus 20, minus 15, regardless. That bottom box becomes an ice box. The bees can't make it through. So now they're stuck on top. And it's still too cold to open the box up, and they're pooping on that bottom box. So they'll survive, but that'll lead me to a point later is then I would move that box and store it somewhere and use it later in the summer. But it's full of poop. And until I got my microscope, I didn't realize what was in the poop. Okay, so you can see we do things, and the reason I like a medium and a deep is good, or just a single deep. Why? Because it's volume the bees can handle, especially if you're insulated. Wood boxes, you need to make sure it's well sealed and insulated. But for poly folks, especially with R 20 to 30 on top, basically you're good. So this is, I had gone 3 years with no losses, so I had 4 colonies. I'm not a commercial beekeeper, and everything was super, super, super. That first winter I lost one in an experiment, wood versus poly. And then the next 3 years, they were all getting through the winter, and then I got this. This is when I was using candy boards, but you can see, it stunk. And then the bees were coming up. Actually, this was 2017, the first time I came to the session we were having at the Bee Expo. It was that same winter. So this is all feces. And the reason it's so yucky is I remember bringing honey at that session, and I think it was Tracy. She said, "Oh, you probably have honeydew." I said, "Honeydew? What the hell is honeydew?" Okay. And then I started researching honeydew. So every morning where it got cold, my bees would puke out thousands of bees. And then eventually there's no more bees in there, they're all dead. Okay, they can't fly off because it's minus 40. Okay, and because of those fluctuation temperatures, they just puke out. You can see I did use a top entrance, so they were puking out the top, and then I used a piece of plywood in the front to keep the front entrance shaded. And you can see it actually looks like a pin setup. So now I use the bubble foil wrap to wrap multiple hives together so they can share heat, but it's to reduce the rate of heat loss. Okay, the rate of heat loss is wind chill. Okay, when the wind is blowing by that colony, if you have micro seams and things, your heat loss increases. So by having that little shell, one, it reduces the solar impact. It's reflecting the solar heat that I don't want at this time. I want to keep them stable. But it also reduces the impact of the wind. And for me, it's my wind shell. So literally, that summer, again, my fault. I went canoeing up in the Arctic. I did one of the Arctic rivers. This is my dog enjoying a nice slope. We canoed 400 kilometers down this river. Beautiful. 21-day trip. Fantabulous. Then I get home. I gotta get my bees ready now. Okay? Unbeknownst to me. So again, I'm a solo beekeeper. I wasn't home to do my honey supers. That year, I had the most honey I ever had in my colonies. But it was like molasses. Dark molasses, tasted woody, beautiful on peanut butter and toast. Oh. So dark honey. So technically in the winter we don't get cleansing flight. We had one of those crazy winters, dysentery all over the place, high stress. This is what got me to buy my microscope. Altruistic bees is bees flying out to die, but they can't really because it's too cold, so they're pooping and dying inside. Population eventually is too small. There's crazy temperature swings. Literally, I need to prepare earlier. There's no late summer forage. It was the first time me experiencing honeydew honey. So I had it analyzed, now I can spot it on the microscope. The thing with this honey, typically a nice native honey or clover honey is 70 to 78% glucose and fructose. And sometimes there's some fructose in there, or sucrose. This honeydew was 50% glucose and fructose. 50%. Okay? Those are the easy sugars that bees can digest. The thing with honeydew honey is the bees don't have the enzymes to break the sugars down. So it had raffinose and all these funky names of different sugars, but really complex sugars that the bees can't digest. Okay? So the honey has 50% less energy per volume than a typical honey. It had no SEMA. It was freaking cold. I used a top entrance that I didn't really understand the impact of with an open screen bottom board. So all these things compounded to this. This colony also had amoeba, but I discovered that later. Okay? So amoeba is another winter disease that I dealt with, but it's typically not too much of a problem. So typically a bee can hold about 30 to 40% of their body weight in feces before they need to poop. So you can see that if this honey, and the thing with honeydew is dark honey usually has more stuff in there, so ash content they say, that they can't digest. So it just accumulates in the hindgut. And eventually they're like, I can't hold it anymore. And then this happens. And because it's so cold, they can't cleanse, then they poop inside. And this poop here is, I guess, later on I discovered it was full of nosema and these amoeba spores. So cold winter, we had a lot of -40s, dysentery like no other day, behaviors of bees, just watching them, they go out and die. So all these massive bees flying out, I think the bees were just so stressed. They said, I can't take it anymore, and they just flew up and died. And then a dead hive. So then I started training other beekeepers. They said, hey, I need a hand. So if I'm gonna go do a canoe trip, I need somebody to give me a hand. Okay, those things I can't do. And this is how groups like this, you can actually start helping each other. So this is where now, it's actually late July. I pull my honey late July, first week of August. Non-negotiable. Why? Because of this experience and knowing that August is honeydew season for me, because the plants are more stressed, you get frost, and the plants and the aphids are just pretty much the aphids are peaking population-wise, and that's when the most honeydew gets generated. And we have, in the Yukon, there's 57 species of aphids. And they're associated to specific plants. The majority of them have a primary plant they're associated with. And actually, if you wanted to do a study on aphids, it's quite fascinating. So backfill the brood nest with sugar syrup. Literally, I don't need the candy board anymore. I just need to make sure that bottom box has, if I do a single, 75 pounds. If I do a double, about 100 pounds. And that's all in. His thing there where you do the tilt test, if it's like, heavy enough. So I don't use a weight scale. Lots of insulation on top. And just to clarify, it's actually about 15% extra heat from the top. And the sidewalls, it's all relating to VR factor. And that, because it's a lot warmer on top, so you do get that 15 to 25% more heat loss on top. And by putting more insulation on top, you're actually pushing the heat halo downwards, so that there's a bigger area that's warmer in that box. So this is where I tried. I did say this is Hive Alive, and do use it, but it's more preventive or control than it's not going to heal the problem. It's more for maintenance, and it does have impact on the gut and cleansing, but there still needs to be a lot of research on that. And then this is where I learned about volume is I don't like doubles because that frozen box in the bottom creates me headaches later in the winter. And I can't pull it till early spring. And basically not home to do during a warm spell. So for example, if I'm not there and we get a warm spell mid-March, I can't consolidate it, so I can't rely on that. So mites won't be a problem because of your long winter brood breaks. 3 years. Okay? And I do similar, so I treat in spring, and a lot of times I get away with 1 or 2 treatments, and it's fine. And I may do a treatment in the fall just to get a feel for the numbers by a drop. But yeah, so usually 2 treatments of oxalic acid vapor in the early spring is good. Because we do have a long root break, and early at that time before that first pollen patty, most of the mites are exposed and they're susceptible to the treatment. And I have used formic acid once, and I've never seen so many mites in my life. So imagine this probably 20-fold. And it was post my experiment where I let a colony collapse. I had to do something, so I put 2 pads with a little shim, because the thing with polys, most of the experiments and the testing is done on wood colonies, not done in polys. Okay? The environment inside a poly, when the temperatures fluctuate, is different.
Yeah.
Okay, so I actually put a shim just to make sure there was enough air, because the concentrations are different. Because remember those histograms I showed you of the inside temperature? It applies, and basically wall to wall, the average temperature in there is 25 degrees. I don't mind feeding liquid syrup in, say if I had to, in March. When there's still risk of -20, I won't do it. But knowing the environment inside, there's no risk of moisture. I don't mind feeding a bit later in the season, because the dynamics inside that box is so that it's much warmer. In a wooden box, that moisture would be a killer. But in a poly, there's natural convection. The average temperature in that box is way, way more than a wooden box. We have a 20-degree head start on a wooden box. Okay, so don't do it, but just you have a bit of flexibility there in the early spring. So these are just pictures. This is what PMS looks like. There's some shared picture, but it looks like everything. It looks like chalk brood, sack brood, spotty brood, deformed wing. It's got everything. It's really, really confusing. Okay? But if I did my mite count and my treatment, I did a formic on this thing after, and it was like thousands. Okay, so that's where I said, yeah, I can't be treatment free. I need to do something. And then that's where I got to treat early in the spring, and it resolved most of my challenges. You can make honey in splits / swarms. This was more mine, because people kept saying, oh, you can't keep these on any lake road, it's too cold. And I was like, I'll figure it out. You tell me I can't, and I'll figure it out. So this is where I bought some extra sensors. I bought some weight scales, so I could actually understand the nectar flows, and the weight gains, the weight losses. And then that gave me a dimension I didn't have before that helped me understand more about what the environment's about. I did get a grant to do a honey project, so I did 65 honeys. Like I said, 40 from the Yukon, a few people from here shared their honey. I did pollen analysis, and I did chemical analysis. So the grant paid for a lot of that. I committed to doing the pollen analysis myself to figure it out. And then the lab did the other ones. And that's where I know about all my percentages of sugars and the type of sugars and the different phenols and the stuff in the honey is I've got it tested. Okay, so what your sugar is not the same. Like I gave them a jar of honey. It's crystallized. It's honey from this year or last summer. The jar from last year, the year before, hasn't crystallized yet. That honeydew that stunk up that colony from 10 years ago hasn't crystallized yet. There's a beekeeper that showed me honey from 30 years ago, same color, same thing, hasn't crystallized yet. So every season I get different honeys, and it's never consistent. So, but this helped me understand some of these dynamics. So pH. So you just do the math. Say, when is the bee generated? When is the bee, when's the new, I guess, generation starting? When's the first times in flight? You just do one date minus the other date. It gives you a number. So that's the approximate age. So you can see how if I do nothing, winter bees are in the 300-day range. If I feed till August, or the last natural pollen is around August, this is the ratio, and then I'm happy with this one here. Because now I do first patting here, and I make sure there's protein on the colony until this date, so that the bees are about 200 days. Knowing that in the past, like, colonies would make it through the winter, but the cluster was okay, but they wouldn't ramp up till July. So by doing what I'm doing now is I actually have to manage swarms in May. When willow's going, so there's willow pollen, there's willow nectar, so they will swarm. So I have to do something. Okay, so, but it's a beautiful problem to have. Because it tells you your queen is very healthy, successful, and if you move her to a nook box and do an artificial swarm, move her to another yard, she'll do fine, and that box is going to expand and probably get me some July honey. And that colony there, if I have a substitute queen, it means that I'll get some June honey with that colony. Okay. So for beginners, I say wait till the first cleanse flight. The more experience you gain, the more you know what they're eating. This year I'll have to wait for cleanse flight because they have a lot of spores, they have honeydew honey. I know their guts are full of. So they need to cleanse before I do extra protein, or else they'll have dysentery inside the colony towards the end of the season. I showed you that. So again, rust spores. So this is that honey, dark, molasses-like. I was so happy because it was the first year I ever got lots of honey, 75 pounds per colony at 2 colonies. The other 2 were more resource honey, or colonies, but so now when I do microscopy and I look at my honeys, I know what the difference is. But again, all these are pollen grains. These are Jacob's ladder. For me, Jacob's ladder, willow and lingonberry are quite important. And then here you can see that dark stuff in the bottom, in the background, the grayish. You can see some of these cattail things. So you can see that this is stuff the bees can't digest. So it just builds up. So this is a nice multi-floral honey. There's no background mass. There's a decent amount of pollens versus this they can't digest. Okay, so this, for me, is one of the root causes of dysentery. So can't do singles up north. We pretty much talked about it. So I did do the math. I knew it was coming. So yeah, it's about 3,500 cells on the one side. And if you do the math and you know there's about 8,000, 10 frames, and you do these percentages, there's plenty of space in that box for running a single. Okay? So like I said, you're going to get this PDF. And I actually borrowed this info from that book because he had done the math in Dr. Cotter, and I adapted his information to our context. But the thing you need to watch for is basically the swarming instinct, because it fills up quite fast. So you have to be nimble and you need to know the signs before you do it. Because it's easy. Imagine having 5 of these frames like that. The thing with polys, the nests are much wider and bigger. It happens pretty quick. Okay? So, and sometimes I'll have brood. The reason I like having 2 honey frames on the outside is just to manage this. Because if I only put 1, it means I'll have 8 frames of brood in there. And they might do pollen, it's huge. And it happens so quick, and then it's too many bees too quick. So it's like trying to balance. So I do 2 honey, 6 frames. And then outside edge, there might be pollen on the inside. But what it does, it gives me some breathing room. Because I don't need them to be ready till the first week of June, second week of June. And I guess you learn the little cues as you go. So for singles management, literally, so early spring, so pollen for me, I've stopped putting the feeder on, if there's plenty of food in there, and it's just a single deep. Here it says slatted rack. For singles, it's not too bad, but I rather do that now because it adds me a management step where I have to pull it out late winter for the bees to properly cleanse. So I've stopped using slatted racks. The next step is usually mid-spring. This is almost full. It's already full if it's over winter. What I'll do is I'll add a medium or a deep, but I use mediums for my honey. No excluder. And I'm gonna let the queen do what she has. She has full access to everything. Then early summer, probably a couple of weeks after this, I'm gonna chase the queen down. I'm gonna put the queen down here, I'm gonna put an excluder, and then I may add an extra honey super. There will be brooding here, but it's beautiful brood. Like brood in honey frames is so clean, so beautiful, and the bees, there's a different vitality than sometimes these cruddy dark frames. So I have each of my boxes, I've got probably, I don't know, 10 mediums now that I accept brood on them. Why? Because it's clean wax. It doesn't overwinter, it's only for this period. So sometimes I will put a top entrance so the drones can get out, because there will be some drone brooding here. And then this is where I would do my splits. And then honey super, midsummer, and pretty much it's so easy. So usually early June, when this box is, imagine overwintering, there's still 50 pounds of honey in that box. So it means I don't need to feed in the spring. I don't need to worry about starvation. I'm using polys, so I'm not worried about heating the nest, because I know the dynamics of that nest. So it means this box here, once I do this, I have my honey super. It's like, just let it be. This here is to manage swarming. You give extra space for the queen to lay, it'll buy you a couple of weeks. If it's massive, I'm going to pull resources out of here to make my nook. So this is relieving more swarming stress or potential. And I'm using 1 or 2 frames of brood into a nook, and that's all you need to do. Because imagine, there's 6 to 8 frames of brood in that box. I can afford to pull 2. Okay? And then replace them with empties. Either new wax or empty wax, or let them draw it out. So then, midsummer, so we've got our first nectar flow. A lot of times, both these flows are connected together. If we get decent amount of rain, it's a continuous flow. So it goes from early June, late May, early June, all the way to the end of July, first frost. And then what I do here is I pull my honey, and then I add pollen patty from this point on, and then I put my top feeder, and I just start light feed first, get them going. Usually that first 1-to-1, I might put some hive alive in there just to do a cleanse. And then it's 2-to-1, and I bulk feed a few times. Like I said, no more than, was it 11 kg or 10 kg bags, so 22 pounds of syrup equivalent. And that's all they need. Why? Because this bottom box is already full of honey. And this honey flow is enough. This flow here is beautiful wintering honey. The reason I know it's in there is I'm seeing the pollens now from the flowers that are blooming over here. Not in mass quantities, so I know it's not packed pollen, but it's from the honey, because it actually looks like my honey slides that I did. Okay, so lots of information here. And then basically the cycle restarts, and then I do my winter setup. And then this is where I was losing one colony. There was always one colony that had high nosema, lots of dead bees in front. No dead bees, dead bees. Lots of dead bees, Did bees, no did bees, and then I started squishing bees, dissecting bees, and then this is where I started discovering this amoeba disease. And when I look back at samples from over here, I would notice some of these cysts. They're like little golf balls floating around, and basically they plug up the bees' kidneys. So the organ they use to transfer water from the gut to the hemolymph, so the blood, back and forth, to move toxins from the hemolymph to the feces, help them with their water balance, is, if you look here, there's all these little balls in there. So basically it gave them kidney failure. So you can see how honeydew honey, nosema, super cold, I can't manage my water anymore, so it was the perfect storm. But I was like, why the hell do I keep losing a colony of this every year? Okay, because it took me 2 years to diagnose this one, but they're always noticing a trend year after year. One colony was always like, boom. And then I created this chart. This was before I knew about amoeba. I was like, if I see high mortality, I see high nosema spores, it's going to be dead by mid-May. It'll come out of winter with 10 to 20 frames of bees, but within a month it's gone. Nothing I can do. I tried requeening, I tried to do all these different things. It didn't make a difference. So then I was like, I think I was reading his procedure on fumigation, acetic acid fumigation. So this is another one where you need your big E, because you're taking usually 100%, 99% vinegar. So acetic acid, you're going to cut it down to 70% about, and then you're going to fumigate your empty boxes. And it's to kill nosema spores and amoeba, but it's very, very dangerous. In a sense, if you get it on your skin, it'll create an ulcer and you can't do anything. It'll burn right through. Okay, so I don't recommend it to everybody, but you can see the poop on the frame here. These are all these Rice Krispie squares, or these Rice Krispies. Those are all nosema. And then these little balls here, the marbles, those are amoeba. Okay? So once I had a aha moment. I said, this box here was one of those boxes that I pulled from underneath that was full of poop. And then so we tend to consolidate our colonies early spring. That gear we store somewhere for later. And then we put it back later in the season. So there's a fella called, I think it was Dr. Bailey, back in the UK from the 50s. And he said if you take a colony that has nosema and put it in fresh equipment in spring, it'll be super healthy at the end of the summer. But he said if you put a healthy colony and you give it infected frames later in the summer, it will have a peak of nosema and amoeba in spring. And I was like, they knew about this a long time ago. But knowledge is lost over time. So I have a blowtorch. Who here has a blowtorch? If you don't have a blowtorch, you need a blowtorch. Why? It's easy to light your smoker. You can disinfect your tools. So you just put your hive tool on top of wood or a fence, something that won't burn. And between inspections, you keep 2. I always have 2 to 3 hive tools in my yards, because I'll lose one, but then it gave me 2 left. But as I inspect one colony, if you suspect a sick colony, inspect it last, not first. And then disinfect your tool after each use. So put the tool there, burn it, really nice and hot, leave it there, take your other tool, do your inspection, put the tool there, burn it hot, take the other one. If you use gloves, have multiple gloves. If you have sick colonies, use your gloves only with that colony. The reason I know this is because of this stuff. Okay? When I did this experiment, I also used Q-tips. I soaked it in hot water, and I swabbed the inside of the cells. and then I put it on the slide. Guess what I found? And these were my clean brood frames. I found this, not in this concentration, but I found Nosema and Amoeba in the bottom of the cells. And these were my cleaning equipment. So, guess what I did? I scraped the wax off. I kept the wax, not for the bees, for humans. And I threw probably a good 100 frames. It was hurtful, but 10%, again, $500, like a colony is worth $500. To bring a nook last year was $450. Okay, if I brought a package, it'd be probably $400. So you can afford to do this stuff. The key is prevention. So if you can avoid the symptoms, you can actually avoid, a lot of these were my original frames. But now that I know about honeydew, I know about feces, I can reduce the chances of equipment getting soiled. Me using singles, not having a box underneath, means that the bees won't go up and then poop down on those frames. So that's why I like singles. It avoids a lot of this stuff. But I'm telling you right now, singles, I recommend polys up here for singles, because at least you know your base insulation is good, and you can seal it really well. And you can put extra insulation on top using a medium or a deep. You just stuff it with extra insulation, and you will have a toasty thing. And the fear of starvation, if you fed them well in the fall or late summer, is very, very low. Okay? So this is what it looks like. Basically, I stacked my frames up. I put some acid in here. I sealed it up with seal tape. Then I left it there for about 2 weeks. And you think vinegar strong? It smells strong? Whew. So I did have I have a half face. I do wear goggles. And if it's really windy, I won't do my OEV. But I do agree with full face shield, because it is really windy up here. So I'd say bare bones, wear proper goggles that have side shield that seal around the face, so you won't get it in your nose or in your face. And that's for OAV, but also this stuff. So do you need top ventilation? So the answer is no. Is it wrong? No. But you just need to manage the flow through air. And you can do that by the size of your bottom entrance. Like I said, the reason in the prairies they need a top entrance is they get way more snow than I do. Most of their colonies get buried in snow, and they can't even see them. So, and they can't go and clean out that entrance like I do. Okay, so they need the top entrance because the dead bees will drop in the bottom, and then they're guaranteed a vent hole. Snow is a wonderful insulator. If I had more snow, I'd probably do it the way they do, but I don't get much snow. Okay, so it's cold, but no snow. So what this is this is the outside temperature. Okay? These pink dots here, this is data from inside a wood colony, and this is insulated colonies. Convection airflow is managed, it's driven by the difference between inside temperature versus outside temperature. The bigger that difference, the more airflow you'll get. Okay? So once you understand that principle, you're like, So that's why when it warms up, outside, it actually warms up, your ventilation inside that box actually reduces. The natural flow reduces, and the bees get a bit more stress, CO2 level will climb up a bit more. But in general, I'll show you the next slide, CO2 is not that much of a problem, and I want it higher than lower. Okay, but what this is see how as it gets colder, the natural convection actually increases. So it's a perfect relationship. And it goes back to that tree nest. Okay, as it gets colder outside, and the bees get a bit more agitated, or their metabolic rate increases a bit more, naturally, the difference increases, so the ventilation increases. In a wood box, you don't have that. the temperature inside is almost the same temperature as outside. So there's no natural ventilation. Hence, they need top ventilations, they need shims, they need all these things. And the bees can't do this. They can't vent in the winter if they're in cluster. Okay, so basically the cluster becomes a survival mechanism. And for them, ventilation is actually quite important. Okay, so it's understanding the context and the why. So this is an example of, I think it was not too cold, -8. This is what it looked like. And then I had my IR camera on a stick, and I stuck it in the bottom entrance, and I filmed my cluster from side to side to understand what this seems from underneath. So this is me looking up. So the majority of the seams had bees right to the bottom. The full single was full. So you can see some heater bees, bee bums, and stuff like that. But the last seam here was completely empty. And then I was like, that's how they're venting, because that's how natural convection works. They need a cooling channel for that heat to flow down and flow out. Okay, so hence the reason the bees they've got it figured out. We just need to work with them to give them what they need to do things. So this here was a setup with 9 sensors. And then there was a fellow who helped me model the temperature so I could do it at heat map. But quite interesting. And so this is that phenomenon. And so the condensing wall is usually on the outside towards the bottom. So hence the reason I like open screen bottom boards to drain the excess condensation out of the walls. The other thing is, like I mentioned before, that open screen bottom board helps keep the bees chilled to that perfect temperature. Not too hot, not too cold. It keeps them in that sweet spot. So that if it does get warm outside, they won't get hot too quick. So I will never insulate my bottom boards ever again after this winter. Why? Because my gut feel is they're consuming more honey right now. I'll be able to confirm it in a couple of months. Because we've had a few fluctuations and the bees seem more active than normal. So assess moisture. So this is an example of, I've got this over 5 seasons. It's the same thing. So I convert relative humidity to grams of water per cubic meter. So it's apples to apples. So literally, I want to know how much water is in the air right now, currently. This black line here, so these are the outside temperatures. This is the amount of water in the outside air. This is the amount of water at my front entrance. Inside the cluster, this is the amount of water for all these temperatures. Okay? This is no brood. When the bees start brooding, this goes up to 25 to 30. So what it told me is, here, the bees are getting almost no water from the environment. So they have to make this water up through their honey consumption. Because I said, every pound of honey produces an excess of about a bit more than a cup of water. They actually need that water, or else they'll dry out. So when I manage my bees, I'm trying to figure out how to maximize, reduce the water loss. Okay, so, because I was in Tennessee that first time, and I said I think it was about just under 30 degrees Fahrenheit. And then I mentioned how it's around here. I said, your bees, if you do the percentage, I said, they're only getting 20% of the water they need right now. And it was almost 100% humidity. Because people they misunderstand what relative humidity means. It's temperature related. So the reason I brought it to this, grams per cubic meter or cubic yard, is so that we understand it from the bee's perspective. What do they need? Where are they trying to maintain? Okay, they're HVAC units. Heating, ventilation, air conditioning, that's what bees are. They maintain the internal environment. So like I said, no brood, and once there's brood, it goes up to 25 to 30 at these temperatures. So even though we know these numbers already, until I charted it and I made it, I was like, makes sense. So, and then it makes sense that bees early spring, a lot of times are really thirsty. Because they're transitioning from no brood to brood, so their water requirement grows by 100%. I need way more water to raise that new brood. Okay? Luckily, they need a bit more heat, so they produce more honey to heat up the inside of the box, but in a poly, it's insulated. It's minimal heat requirements. Almost done. CO2. So there's a bunch of studies out there about the potential benefits of elevated CO2. Still a lot more studies to do. But bees can actually regulate really high levels of CO2, up to like 8% or higher, slightly higher. But you can see they trigger and they vent out on purpose. CO2 is actually used to basically put queens in a coma at much higher percentages, so they can do their checks on it. But what it actually does is it lowers their metabolic rate. So instead of, say, this is my rate here, it's called the ultra low metabolic rate. So it kicks it even lower. So, because I'm trying to figure out why my bees consume so much less honey than the average colony out there, considering my winter. And it's more than just insulation. And when I do the math, they should be consuming about 50 pounds. But they're in the 30 pounds. So there's probably some stuff here that's quite interesting, and then there is some evidence that higher CO2 will have an impact on fur oil. So then what I'm trying to do is, okay, right now my question I'm trying to answer is, what is the level in a northern wintering hive that's not in the shade? And literally, last chart, this pink line here, that is O2 level. CO2 sensors are really expensive, and they're complicated, and they use too much battery. This gray, or the background color, that's CO2 sensor, but the problem is it's capped out at 10,000 ppm, so 1%. So I needed a way to figure out what the CO2 level is without spending so much money. So I found a reasonably priced O2 sensor that takes a reading every 15 minutes. The CO2 is every 5 minutes. The black line is the inside temperature just above the cluster. The blue line is my weather station, so outside temperature, and I've got humidity in there and all that. But you can see where the brood nest is around 20 degrees or just above the nest. The CO2 drops here, or the O2 drop to 16%. Just so you know, typically it's 21% oxygen in the environment. My sensor is actually set up 22 is 21, so it's offset. So technically my O2 was just close to 8%. But then I cleaned out my entrance and it popped up. So this is where, if you watch one of my videos where these plastic things we have our entrances, creates ice and frost because it conducts heat too easy. One reason I will never use mesh in mouse guards anymore is they keep freezing up and my bees keep dying up and plugging up the lower entrance. I need to control the mice, but aluminum, stainless steel, all that type of stuff conducts heat really well. And what was happening is, my CO2 was accumulating over time, because you can see the temperature, we're in the minus 35 here, and it accumulated because ventilation with that bottom entrance is getting plugged. And then I'm like, oh, what do I do? So I cleaned it out, and it spiked back up. And then this is where I just ripped that piece of plastic out of my front entrances, throw it away, and I was all pissed off and angry. Just joking. And then I just used styrofoam, blue foam to make an entrance reducer, left about close to 4 inches. It's about 3/4 inch high. I'll cross my fingers that shrews don't find it. But you can see how it took me a couple of iterations. Here it was about 2 inches. Here I did 2 inches, then it came back about 2 inches, and then 4 inches. It's not as cold, and this is still December. So the data I have now is it's fairly flat. It does drop, but they're able to maintain that 1%, 2%, but I want 4%. So you can see how I can tweak it, and over the winter I'll be trying to get that sweet spot of 4%. Because 4% and below is where some of these experiments were done on varroa. So I'm trying to do varroa treatment without doing varroa treatment. Okay, but it's an experiment and we'll see what happens. And then this is just how it works. Every bee produces a certain amount of CO2 per hour. And if you're an HVAC person, over time, depending on how much ventilation you have, so this means 10 air exchange per hour. So imagine the volume inside that box. You're changing that volume of air 10 times in 1 hour. Okay, you can see that literally there is no accumulation of air exchange there. 4 air exchanges per hour. 2 exchanges per hour, 1 half of 1, so every 2 hours and every 4 hours. And you can see how that's how you figure out how much air those bees are moving, or how much natural convection is there. So you can see it's detailed, and it's probably above where you want to be, but this is where you adjusting these entrances and moving and tweaking little things, it does have an impact. Okay? And you can see sometimes you make it too small, your bees will get stressed out. Okay? So sometimes you get these venting events where the bee says enough already. And then they heat up, because I do have a sensor on the bottom. And when it spikes, it tells me the bees just broke cluster and they're venting. Okay, and so I can see the different conditions, and basically the bees, if they're not happy, they're stressed, they'll be noisy. If you're listening to your colony, you shouldn't hear anything. If your bees are making noise, there's something wrong. Or there's something, I'll say, fishy. If you tap your colony like that, you'll get a CO2 spike like that. Why? Because I've done it. Okay, all it takes is a tap. Once those bees start making noise, you're going to get a CO2 spike. So don't disturb the bees if you don't have to. And I guess that's the moral of the story. And that was it.